Your name, please?
Andres Duany.
And where are you from?
I'm Miami, Florida.
And DPZ?
And DPZ is my firm, yes, and I'm also married to Elizabeth Platter-Zeebrook, who will probably be interviewed as well.
Right. Tell me why you're here and what you'd like to see come out of this conference.
Well, it's dawning on me that this is a special conference, slowly. There are many conferences all over the world, and they add up to nothing because there is a kind of, I think, prerogative to debate, to have terribly amusing sort of, fights between people of different ideologies. And what I'm beginning to understand in this one is that there is a common understanding of common sense, that basically people who are invited here are more or less on the same page about loving cities and observing closely how they work, and not about positioning themselves ideologically one way or the other. There's also a nice mix, I think, of practitioners and academics. And these conferences, they're essentially allergic to each other these days. The academy and the practice are, as Liz once explained to me not too long ago, they're just different fields. Don't even try to bring them along, they're different fields. And I think that's very insightful. What the academy is trying to accomplish is perfectly, I think, understandable and elegant and viable, but it's not what we're trying to accomplish in practice. And I think that most of the people speaking here, although there are some professors, most of the people are practicing. So that's special. Then I always love conferences that take place in locations that are the verification of what we're talking about. It keeps you honest. I intend certainly to pull examples from Stockholm when I speak, and this is a city that grew against all odds of topography, of climate, of peripheral location in Europe. It grew against all odds into being an enormously sophisticated and, I think, viable city in the way that we value. And so if they could do it here, at the furthest reaches of Europe, why can this kind of thing, this kind of city, not be implemented in the proximity of Paris or in the proximity of London or in anywhere in post-war Italy? What is it that prevented the planners of the post-war from succeeding? And there's actually not enough, I think, criticism so far. I think that the positive tone of the conference, I hope it is superseded, and that we begin to, I think, call out culprits. The high design architects who are interested only in objects. There's some allusion to that, but I think that I think calling it out. I think that the schools of architecture actually taking talented and energetic and ethically concerned students and turning them into our sort of artistic monsters, and basically diverting them from their mission, the mission of their generation, which is to make cities, for themselves, for their generation. They're distracted as can be. So I think that, I don't know where the conference is going to go in the next couple of days. I'm speaking absolutely last. So I will have something else to say, I'm sure, by then. But at the moment, it's very comforting. I feel that the temperature is very comfortable.
Well, there's a declaration that's supposed to come out at the end, and you're suggesting maybe there needs to be a bit more iconoclastic confrontation or discussion of where things need to go beyond the sort of what was discussed earlier as being a kind of a stalemate. That, as Fred Kent put it, we're hurrying, rapidly going nowhere.
Well, that's an interesting question. What should the statement be? Should it be a polemic and disruptive? I think somebody mentioned that today, that they want it to be disruptive. Should it be comforting, which obviously is going to be more comfortable for many of the mayors and I think politicians that we're addressing in this. After all, it's the mayors really that have a say in this kind of thing. And then there is the whole idea of whether you make mission statements or manifestos. And actually, I was having an internet discussion today between why the manifesto has basically receded from view. Everyone was doing that in the early 20th century. And now we have these mission statements that are a concatenation of intentions. You know, we want to be this, we want to be diverse, we want to be that. I think if this ends up being a mission statement, it won't be noticed at all. It just won't be noticed. I do think that the world is in such a state that it requires a certain impatience. You know, that's a word that when they say be patient, I say why? There's absolutely no time to be patient. You know, at the rate at which things are going.
Rome burns, as they say.
Rome burns, but actually it's not just that climate change is ongoing, it's the Chinese are about to build 20 cities the size of Paris in 20 years, and they're completely self-destructive. I mean, you cannot actually just say, well, let's take our time, maybe we'll catch it at the 6th Paris. They may get 6 of them wrong, but eventually they'll figure it out. That's extremely cruel, I think. First of all, to the Chinese people, who have to put up with this kind of lesser life. You know, they'll never know what it's like to live in a city, not only like Stockholm, but they won't know what it's like to live in a city like Beijing. You know, they will have missed that. There'll be drones in what we already know are failed patterns. So I think impatience is something that we need to transmit in this document at the end. You know, I don't think we need to frighten anybody, but I think we need to hurry them up, actually.
A sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Well, there's an irony in what you describe in China, of course, because it's our model. And there have been efforts, notably by you and others, to reform that CM model to create a new urbanism, which is somewhat controversial certainly among other architects, and yet it seems to be taking hold in policy circles as a kind of agenda for the UN, for UN Habitat in particular.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that actually, I'd say that this new urbanism was inevitable as a correction of the very evident failures. I think that actually it's the paradigm in the discussion of common folk, and I don't exclude the mayors. Problem is that the professionals are very much against it, and so it's a very noisy and distracting debate. You know, it is the paradigm in people's minds. It is the paradigm in many, many of the documents, Smart Growth, Agenda 21. All of those, it's the paradigm, but the architects are causing, and I mean the architects, not even the planners, not even the engineers anymore, but the architects are causing such fantastic confusion that actually the world, and they're so preponderant in their demands to make, the Bilbao effect. We will correct, we'll fix your city with a great Bilbao building.
The silver bullet.
The silver bullet. But what happens actually, if you know Bilbao, and I know Bilbao very well, that's where I'm going next, because I work there, Bilbao barely notices the Bilbao itself, the city, was an absolutely marvelous city before. And it became better with a metro, and it became better with cleaning up its riverfront. That counts. And it's also, of course, very good because the people are polite, and they dress well, and they're respectful of each other, and they're hardworking. And all of these things are very important. They haven't eviscerated their center. You know, the schools haven't moved to the suburbs, that kind of thing. And that's what's really important. But yet the architectural cabal is actually saying, well, it's really the museum that has done it, and they've been flogging this dead horse now for 20 years. But I wish you could sort of settle into Bilbao, as I have, and see what little part it plays on anyone's life and on the delights of the day, you know.
But isn't that a kind of product design, product packaging in a sense? We were talking earlier about Kenneth Frampton, who's very critical of the sort of starchitecture and the way that it's become a form of commodification of a product.
Yeah. Well, Kenneth Frampton, I haven't spoken to him since Princeton 35 years ago. But I think what Frampton says always makes sense, what he writes. However, somehow he seems to be somewhat boxed in an academic culture that doesn't permit him to make a proposition that would, let's say, be on our side. In what we study in terms of success, like if this succeeds in a non-ideological way, we will do a street like this. This is the street that works. We know that. Let's emulate the street. Frampton always has to add innovation and a kind of avant-garde overlay to it. And so he undermines his own very intelligent position at the last moment. It's always the footnote that confuses everybody.
And isn't that the same idea that we must not copy anything from before 1920, from even from ourselves, perhaps?
Yeah. Yes, the most overused idiotic word is innovation. And innovation is dependent upon the way it's taught in the academy these days is through amnesia. They've actually instituted a regime of amnesia of history. The students don't know anything. And so everyone can pretend that that what the students are doing is innovative. When I go in for a jury, I look at the most avant-garde, innovative, quote-unquote, projects, and I actually give the source. I say, well, I know where this is an illusion or an emulation of this or that. And when I make that statement, the whole thing falls apart. Basically, people are in tears and they get desperate because the fiction that's maintained, the fantasy that's maintained is continual innovation. And that's maintained through an ignorance of history. I swear, an amnesia. It takes quite a while to establish it, but I think in most architecture schools, the students do not look at anything but the very latest magazines, and they do not know that their own professors, the Herzog and de Meurons, the Rem Koolhaases, these people actually secretly have libraries, which they continually refer to, at least libraries in their minds by now, and they do not have the courtesy or the honesty to actually teach the students that their creativity actually has sources. So there's been now a generation of students that really is, I think, very, very disappointed in itself because they're not, I think, achieving the creativity of the Rems and the Herzog and the Meurons, and that's because the students have created the fantasy that they don't need to know anything.
And then they're not as employable either.
Well, they actually drop out of architecture, and they become, it's not bad in education. And architecture education is very good for filmmaking, it's a very good education. I would always recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it for architects. Anybody who wants to be an architect, I would recommend apprenticeship. Like people ask me all the time, where shall I go to school? And I said, are you prepared to spend $40,000 a year? And they said, yes. Well, for that, you can actually apprentice in 4 offices in Europe per year. And not only learn what you learn in practice, but you can actually use these various cities to teach yourself. Much better deal. But the academy holds them in, that certification is held over them. I think actually that this conference should end in should conclude, well, first of all, it's one of 3 conferences, but it should conclude in a systematic international education agenda. I think it has to overcome, this is not the first conference of its kind, I think it has to overcome a problem that we've had before with Europe. You know how the Spaniards don't get along with the English and the French, and there probably isn't a Frenchman in this entire conference.
How that lived in Spain as a child.
Yeah, I lived in Spain. And something that's very notorious is that the French never come to anything. And so how do you actually, is Europe actually, it's going to take really something, a kind of sense of despair with bad cities finally, just an impatience that is going to perhaps get the Europeans to come together on something. In the US it's been easier. We have more of a common culture. In other countries like Australia, Canada, it's been a lot easier. But Europe is quite disparate. We'll see. Well, anyway, I'd love to, I think you have to get rid of this interview and interview me again in a day, because what's happening in there is really fast.
Yeah, I'm going to let you get back to it. Any other final thoughts about this as a global conference and the ultimate opportunity to engage with UN Habitat and interact with their agenda?
Well, I think that the UN is capable of great good, and it's certainly, in some places, it's the only agent of good. You know, everybody else is a kind of SOB, you know, irresponsible middle classes that don't care, elected officials that don't care. And I think the UN is a great, I think, force for good in some countries. I don't think in every country. It's necessarily that the UN will have an effect. For example, I don't think in the United States it's going to be as effective as this might be in some other places. I work also in Cuba, and I think that anything that comes to Cuba through the UN would be much easier to, would be better listened to than anything that comes from the States, obviously. I also would like to add one thing. If this ends up being an emphasis on the very poor of the world, it's going to turn off the middle class. And the middle class are still pulling the levers. You know, we have to be careful. I've run across this problem before. Whenever I concentrate, for example, in Haiti, when I concentrate on the poor, I got very little purchase. Then I finally realized, how could they be so uninterested in, and then when I began to fold in middle class housing, as well as housing for the poor, then they were happy. And as always, an emphasis. We need, you know, the power really resides in the middle class. And I would always enter, the middle class is the one that's going to cause the revolution. The middle class is the one that's going to help the poor. But to begin with the poor, I think, I don't think it's going to work in the long run. It's the Venezuela problem. You know, it works in the short run, but urbanism is in the long run. And I think we should keep our eye on the long run. You know, what's it going to, you know, the year 2040 or something like that. Perhaps that should be. Oh, by the way, also another thing is the present is a distortion field. I think if this conference concentrates too much on the present, I don't think that we would be extrapolating correctly. I think that the future, even, let's say, within one generation, is going to be more different than we think. So we need to displace ourselves, make ourselves uncomfortable relative to the present.